So this is the model economy that we're going to use to try and think about macro things. So just as a quick review, you need to remember, you need to be able to do the following things, which we discussed. One is that, as shown in this picture, you can see the aggregate demand curve slopes down, but of course you need to remember why. And there's more than one reason, but the main reason that we focused on is that inflation erodes the real value. This is a very concise way of putting it, of your savings or your wealth. In other words, when there's inflation, to the extent that there's inflation, any wealth that you have that isn't indexed is worth less in terms of final goods and services. Okay, remember that inflation is on the y-axis, real GDP is on the x-axis. We use the letter pi to represent inflation often. IE here, excuse me, is expected inflation. So focusing on the demand, we need to know why it slopes the way it does, and we also need to know what shifts it. The way to remember what things might shift the demand curve is by remembering that aggregate demand is made up of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. And remembering this is useful because, of course, the things that shift this curve are going to be just anything that affects consumption, investment, government spending, or net exports. If any of those things change, then the demand curve may shift one way or another. And if it does, that expected inflation may be different from whatever inflation you actually end up with. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through a whole bunch of examples of things that can happen in this model. This corresponds to chapter 22. Now, of course, demand isn't everything. There's also the supply. And we discussed what happens with the supply curve regarding, first of all, why it slopes, why it has the shape it does. So it slopes up, as you can see in this picture. And again, the question is why? And the argument was because wages tend to rise with expected inflation. And therefore, any inflation above or below means that real wages, i.e. wages in terms of goods and services, end up different from what was expected. So high inflation means that higher inflation than expected, rather, means low wages compared to all other prices, which encourages production. And that accounts for this slope here. Similarly, we also have to remember what is it that shifts the supply curve. And there are two things. One, well, we can see that it crosses the long run curve at expected inflation. So of course, if anything changes expected inflation, then the curve is going to shift. Right? If something happens that increases your expected inflation, let's say you've observed higher than expected inflation rates for years, so you figure, well, I guess I was wrong, I expect higher inflation, then of course this curve would shift up. Similarly, if for years you observe inflation that's lower than what you expected, then you might adjust your expectation, so this curve would shift to correspond to that lower expected inflation. But it's not the only factor that might shift the supply curve, and that's important to remember. The other thing that could affect the position of the supply curve is what the textbook calls supply shocks. Remember, I refer to them as cost shocks, the reason being that I think calling them cost shocks reminds us of what it must be that's ultimately behind them. Remember, a supply shock is something that raises the cost of inputs, like, well, we discussed the case of oil shocks. Right? If the price of oil quadruples, then of course that makes production harder, more expensive, discourages production, and you will end up with the supply curve shifting. So again, what we're going to, so this is a review of how this whole thing is put together, this model. What we're going to do today is go through different scenarios to understand, first of all, how does the model work? And second, given that we understand how the model works, what should the Fed do in different circumstances? All right, so that's the idea. Any questions, comments about this whole setup? Okay, if not, then let's, whoops. Let's start with our first scenario. So the first scenario is going to be hopefully straightforward, a negative demand shock. What's a negative demand shock? A negative demand shock is a shock that first of all hits the demand side. And negative means that it lowers GDP. So something happens that decreases spending. And so then we would be at this point here, where inflation is lower than expected. And equilibrium GDP is also lower than potential. This would be a recession, I guess, a typical recession. So what might cause this to happen? Well, again, remember that the aggregate demand curve is just what we get when we add up consumption, investments, government spending, and net exports. So a change in any factor that affects any of these things that reduces some form of spending could generate this kind of movement in the demand curve. So that includes things like, remember, consumption is affected by disposable income. So if taxes rise, disposable income decreases. Another factor could be transfers declining. Another one could be our wealth deteriorating. Let's say the stock market collapses or housing prices drop. Housing is a big chunk of the wealth of many people. Maybe something happens that lowers government spending, or something happens that lowers exports. Let's say the European Union is a major trading partner of the United States. If the European Union goes into recession, then maybe they can't afford US goods as much, and so exports to the European Union decline. All of these could cause this movement here. Okay? So what we have here is the immediate impact of this surprise change in aggregate demand. Inflation is low, and we have a recession. What happens next, though? There are three possibilities for what happens next. One possibility is that the shock was temporary. Let's say there was a short but temporary decrease in European Union's GDP, so they briefly stopped demanding US exports as much. But then things got back to normal. In that case, what happens? Well, it was just a temporary change in the demand, and eventually it goes back. So it was just a temporary change. That's one possibility. But what if it's a persistent change instead? What if it is persistent? Well, if it's persistent, then the people who live in this economy are observing month after month, inflation is coming in at a value that's lower than they originally expected. Well, let's say this is 2%, and this is 1%. Well, if inflation keeps coming in lower than you expected, what's going to happen eventually? You would reasonably update your expectations and start to expect lower inflation. So pi e here should eventually, if things don't change, eventually expected inflation should decline. What happens when expected inflation declines? Well, this short-run supply curve is no longer the right one. We need a new one that crosses somewhere lower. So the short-run supply curve will shift to the right until eventually we are here. So if this shock is persistent, eventually it will adapt our expectations, affect our expectations, which then again affects this position of the supply curve. And eventually we would end up at this new point where expected inflation is lower, but we have gone back to the long run aggregate supply curve. Okay? This is what the textbook calls the self-correcting mechanism. So if the Fed does nothing and you just leave the economy alone, sooner or later, the economy should be able to adapt to demand shocks in this way. Now, what is the problem though? This picture makes it look as though we kind of don't really care what expected inflation is, right? As long as inflation equals expected inflation, we're on the long run curve, we're not in a recession, we don't have any problems. But I don't know if that's really true. We discussed before that, remember when we were talking about financial crises? We discussed this problem called debt deflation, that when inflation ends up being really low, what happens is that remember, real interest rate equals the nominal minus inflation. If inflation ends up being much lower than expected, then it turns out that any loans that you took out actually involve higher real interest payments. Inflation is low enough. So that suggests that, well, two things. One, it suggests that just letting this self-correcting mechanism act might not be the best idea. It might be a good idea for the Fed to try and do something beforehand to try and make sure expected inflation doesn't end up being too low. The second thing it suggests is that this picture isn't quite right. We might be missing something, right? There's nothing here in this picture to make us be able to visualize what happens if inflation is so low that you have debt deflation, real interest payments are really high, and people start to default on their loans. So if we have time at the end of class, I'll talk a little bit about how we can modify this picture to take account of that. All right? In the meantime, the point is really low rates of inflation as we know from our discussion of financial crises, are not good either. So maybe instead of waiting for the self-correcting mechanism, the Fed should do something. Now, so then, instead of letting, we're back here, we have a negative demand shock, and it's persistent. The question is, what should the Fed do if they decide they want to fight this recession or the deflation that comes with it? Well, what does the Fed control? The Fed controls interest rates. So one thing the Fed could do is try and stimulate spending so that instead of waiting for things to take care of themselves, it actively pushes the demand curve back. And how would it do that? It would lower interest rates. By lowering interest rates, it could encourage spending, either consumption or investments. And if it encourages spending, it gets to push this demand curve back where it is, or back where it would have been. At least that's the idea, right? So the simple game here, the Fed does nothing, eventually expected inflation adjusts. We may not want to wait that long because it requires enduring a recession, and it may also, if the recession is severe enough, lead to deflation, which is bad. So instead of waiting, the Fed may want to lower interest rates to try and get the demand curve back where it would have been otherwise. Okay? Any questions, comments about all this negative demand shock business? If not, then let's move on to number 2. What's scenario number 2? Well, we just looked at a negative demand shock. Now let's look at a positive demand shock. What's a positive shock? Positive means that it increases GDP. So that would be something that increases spending and shifts the demand curve over here. If that happens, then everything is kind of the reverse from what we had before. We have equilibrium inflation that's higher than what was expected, and we have GDP that's a bit higher than potential as well. What could cause this? So same game plan as before. Well, remember that aggregate demand is this. Whoops. Government spending, net exports. And so anything that would lead to an increase in any of these components could shift the demand curve in this direction. Such as what? Well, it could be a decrease in taxes, right? That would increase disposable income. It could be an increase in transfers. It could be an increase in wealth. Or an increase in government spending, or an increase in exports. All of these things could do this. So again, what happens next? What happens next? Well, it depends. Just like before, there are 3 possibilities. One is, what if this was a temporary change? Well, if it's a temporary change, then eventually the demand curve just moves back where it would have been before, and we're done. Right? It's not very interesting, but that could happen. What if it's persistent? That's the second scenario. So again, what if this shock turns out to be persistent? Well, if the shock is persistent, again, we're seeing inflation coming in at a rate that's much higher than was expected, and this keeps happening again month after month after month. Well, the people who live in this economy, they're not stupid. If they realize that inflation is coming in at higher than what they expected, sooner or later, they should figure it out and no longer expect this rate of inflation. They should expect a higher rate. And once expected inflation rises, of course, that's the same thing as saying that the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. The wages are rising at a higher and faster rate. So that decreases supply. And so sooner or later, once again, this is a self-correcting mechanism, sooner or later, expected inflation will rise and we'll come back to the long run. Now, again, the text calls this a self-correcting mechanism, and this picture seems to indicate that we don't really care if expected inflation is high or low. Expected inflation eventually rose, and we ended up back on the long-run curve. But again, remember, that's not quite right, because we know that when inflation starts to get high, people start to waste resources. When there's inflation, prices don't all rise at the same time, right? Some stores will have raised their prices, and some stores won't have gotten around to it yet, because it's costly to change all those price tags. And so when there's high inflation, that means that the gap between the places that just raised their prices and the places that didn't are much larger. So it's worth spending time shopping around to try and find the stores that haven't raised their prices yet, which is wasteful. It also means, of course, that these two places should roughly have the same price. If there's a big gap, to the extent that there's a gap between them, it means somewhere the marginal costs and the marginal benefits can't be equal, right? So again, high inflation introduces inefficiency. What is the point? The point is that it means the Fed may not want to wait for expected inflation to rise. So then the question is, if this shock is persistent, what should the Fed do? Well, again, the Fed controls interest rates. So what it would like to do is try and get this demand curve back here before the high inflation has time to affect expectations. And what they need to do then is discourage spending, which means they need to raise interest rates. All right. So in this second scenario, a positive AD shock, the Fed, it looks like GDP is high, which would seem like a good thing, but if it persists too long, that expected inflation rises, and we know that's bad. So the Fed should raise interest rates before that happens. Okay? Any questions, comments about this scenario? All right. If not, then let's move on to the third scenario. This will be the most fun scenario. Well, okay, it's not fun if it actually happens. And what we're going to look at now is what happens in the case of a negative short-run aggregate supply shock. Right? We talked about demand shocks. Now let's talk about supply shocks. And we'll focus on negative shocks because it's hard to really see how a positive supply shock could be. Remember, these shocks are to do with costs, and the costs of different things can't just easily go. There's a limit on how low costs can be, but they could go up significantly. So negative supply shocks are the ones that we're going to worry about. What causes them? As discussed, this has generally to do with a sharp increase in costs. And the specific example we discussed was, which is a typical example, was when oil prices, or more generally energy prices, rose significantly in the 1970s. But there are plenty of other reasons why. I mean, the reason the oil price increase affects supply negatively is because it's an important cost. So what we're really looking at here is increases in input prices more generally. Okay, it could be the cost of energy, but it could equally well be something else. Like, for example, right now, there are two recent supply shocks. We'll see if they're persistent or not. But for example, if you follow the financial news, you may have heard that the price of semiconductors is going up. What's a semiconductor? Well, it's the chips that go in to make the computer that I'm using to talk to you, or this phone. Various electronic devices have semiconductors in them. Without them, they can't function. And because of this big shift in demand, as people started working from home, suddenly people needed a lot more electronic devices. And guess what? There's not enough of them. There's not enough semiconductors to meet the demand for all the electronic devices that we want now. And so what does it do when there's not enough of something? Its price goes up. So we have a semiconductor price increase due to this shift in demand. And what else? Another thing, for example, any goods that are, nowadays, things tend not to be made in one place, right? The components are made in one place, and then they're shipped to another place where they might be incorporated into another good, which might then be shipped to the place where it's actually going to be used. So let's say semiconductors that are incorporated in Toyota cars might be made in Thailand, and then they're shipped to the United States, where they're put inside the car, which is then assembled in Mexico, which is then sold to a consumer in Canada. So all of those parts need to be shipped around. What if something happens and increases the cost of shipping? It's going to affect all the goods, right? Anything that has this kind of global supply chain. What might increase the cost of shipping? Well, what if some giant ship gets jammed in the Suez Canal? Right? Suddenly, first of all, that causes shortages of whatever things can't get through. Second, okay, you don't have to use the Suez Canal if you're trying to get between Europe and Asia or East Africa. You could go around, depending on which way you're traveling, like Bartolomeu Diaz did. But that takes a lot longer and is more costly. So either way, if there's a disruption to shipping, you're going to get input prices rising, which would be a negative supply shock. So how's that going to show up here? It's an increase in costs, so it should shift the supply curve over here, and you end up with a double whammy of high inflation and low GDP, which one of you referred to last week as stagflation. So negative supply shocks can cause this, at least the initial impact is to cause a little burst of stagflation. All right. So notice again, and this is a little tricky, that when this supply shock comes in, we have a movement in the supply curve that is not connected to a change in expected inflation, at least not initially. Okay, that's a little tricky thing here. That was in one of the exit quiz questions last week. The supply shock, at least initially, nothing's happened to expected inflation. So this crossing point, when there is a supply shock, no longer represents expected inflation, at least not initially. So that's initially. The question is, what happens next? Well, what if the disruption to supply is temporary? Let's say, what if the supply shock came from a ship that blocked the Suez Canal, but fortunately, in a week, we managed to unclog the Suez Canal and everything could get through? Well, then it was temporary, and so the supply curve just goes back where it was before, and we're okay. But again, what if this is a persistent shock? What if it doesn't go away? Well, again, if something doesn't go away, what does it do? It starts to affect expected inflation. It affects expected inflation, then maybe this does become expected inflation. And then now, notice, and as discussed, the Fed isn't going to like that. The Fed doesn't want expected inflation to be too high. On the other hand, it doesn't like this recession either. So when we move to the question of what should the Fed do when it sees a negative supply shock, it's going to be much more complicated. So suppose that what the Fed does is focus on this, focus on the fact that there's a recession. So suppose the Fed fights the recession. What should it do? Well, to fight the recession, we want to increase GDP, so we want to encourage spending, which means we want to lower interest rates, just like with a negative demand shock. What will that do? It shifts our demand curve over here. What has the Fed achieved by doing this? They would have achieved two things. One, they have eliminated the recession. That was the whole point. But they've done something else as well. They've shown that when there's a negative supply shock, what they're going to do is fight it, right? Fight the recession. And in so doing, what have they done? They have increased inflation even more. So anyone living in this economy, after seeing the Fed do this, should conclude what? They should conclude, I expected low inflation before, but I can see now that whenever there's a negative supply shock, the Fed is going to inflate. So going forward, they should expect higher inflation. And that's not good because, as we discussed, even though it's not clearly reflected in this picture, higher inflation does lower GDP because people start to waste resources. So that doesn't look good. All right. But again, that's only one option the Fed has. Suppose instead of fighting the recession, what the Fed does is instead try to fight the inflation. How could it do that? Well, to fight the inflation, we want the demand curve to move this way, which means we're trying to discourage spending, which means we're actually trying to raise interest rates. So it's the opposite of what we had before. And suppose the Fed raises interest rates to the extent that supply and demand cross at the old level of expected inflation. Well, what has the Fed achieved? It achieved the goal of not letting inflation get out of hand. It achieved the goal of not letting people expect higher and higher inflation. But what has it also done? It's made the recession even worse. And so this is the big dilemma of supply shocks. Demand shocks, they move the demand curve, and the Fed, well, with its interest rate policy, can also move the demand curve and try and get it back where it was supposed to be. But with supply shocks, the Fed can't do that. It has to choose to either fight the recession that's caused by the supply shock, and if it does that, then expected inflation can get out of hand. The alternative is to fight the inflation, but if it does that, of course, the goal is to stop inflation from rising, but at what cost? At the cost of worsening the recession. So what happened in the United States? Remember, there was a time in the 70s I mentioned where inflation in the United States rose to like 10% or something. Well, in the late 60s, there were some positive demand shocks caused by the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War dragged on. Eventually, people started to expect higher inflation. Now along came the supply shocks, the oil shocks. All that did is reinforce people's idea that there would be higher inflation. And what did the Fed do? They fought the recessions that were coming from the supply shock, which of course all it did was convince people expected inflation is indeed, we should indeed expect high inflation. Inflation rates rose until 1980, when there was a new Fed chairperson, a gentleman by the name of Paul Volcker. And what did Paul Volcker do? He did this. He decided the inflation is getting too costly, we have to stop it. And of course, how do you do that? You cut rates dramatically. Sorry, you raise interest rates dramatically. That has the effect of lowering inflation, but what does it also do? It causes a recession. And that recession was really sharp. And at the time, people called it the Volcker recession because it was ultimately due to a monetary policy decision that inflation was so high that it needed to be stopped, even if the cost was a short-run, year-long, very sharp recession. So when there are negative supply shocks, they're kind of no good options. Any questions, comments about this? About negative supply shocks and the Fed's unfortunate inability to have any good solutions? All right, if not, then there's one more thing, actually two more things that I think are worth discussing. One is, where are we now? You may have heard in the news that it's being discussed that long-term bond rates, let's say 10-year rates, are rising. Okay? And some people are very worried about this because what could be behind long-term interest rates rising? Remember, long-term rates, let's say a 10-year interest rate, is the expected average interest rate over the next 10 years, plus the risk premium. If the long-term rates are rising, either the risk premium is rising, or people expect interest rates to increase. And why would people expect interest rates to increase? Well, they expect inflation. So why would anyone expect inflation right now? We are here, right? Since since this time last year, more or less, because of the lockdowns and people's changes in behavior, we've been here, right? We've been in a recession, very sharp one, mind you. And so in recessions, we have low inflation. Why would anyone expect inflation to be rising? Well, remember that the federal government passed several $1 trillion of stimulus spending last year. And the Fed also spent several $1 trillion expanding its balance sheet, lending here and there, lowering interest rates to zero, and so on. So what is that doing? Well, it's trying to push back the other way. Remember, the recession was caused in the first place by everyone staying home, not going to restaurants, changing the spending patterns, and reducing spending overall because of the coronavirus. But now people's habits are returning to normal, either because they're sick and tired of not going to restaurants or not going to concerts and whatnot, or because of improved treatments, rollout of vaccinations that just mean that people don't feel the need to take as many precautions as before. So the spending is returning to normal gradually. Now on top of this, add the stimulus that's still out there, right? All those checks are still out there. People are still spending the stimulus money. The Fed's lending programs still continue. So if all that stimulus money is out there and everyone is returning to normal, so i.e. the conditions that caused this decrease in demand are going away, we might overshoot. And if we overshoot, there'll be higher inflation. So I think that's what's going on. And that's a way to think about what's happening here in our framework. We overdid it with the stimulus. Now, I'm not saying that they shouldn't have done that stimulus, but maybe, like for example, I received more than $6,000, no, almost $6,000 in stimulus checks over the past year. Did I really need that? I'm okay, right? There's some people out there who are really suffering, and I hope they got stimulus checks too, but there was no point stimulating me. That's overshooting, I think. All right, so that's the first thing that I thought I wanted to do at the end of class. The second thing is, remember I told you that there's a way of changing this picture to try and think about what happens when inflation is too low. And that's to be found, I believe it's at the end of chapter 22. I just thought I should mention it so that when you get to that point, you know what they're talking about, okay? So remember that we talked about debt deflation in a particular context. The idea was that if inflation is really low, what happens? We have what we called debt deflation. And the idea there is that, again, the real interest rate is the nominal interest rate minus inflation. If unexpected inflation turns out to be really low, that's raising real interest rates on outstanding debt for which the nominal interest rate is given, right? And that makes the real burden of paying back the debt much heavier. If inflation is low enough, then the real interest rate might be so high that people can't pay and they start to default. What this suggests is that if inflation is low enough, then it's no longer true that lower inflation increases aggregate demand. There might be a point at which low inflation actually starts to decrease demand because people are defaulting. Okay? Now the textbook actually raises this in a slightly different context. but the effect is going to be similar. They raise it in the context of what's called the zero lower bound, or the ZLB. Does anyone know what the zero lower bound is? Or to put another way, I guess, zero lower bound on what? It's the, exactly, Marshall, it's the zero lower bound on interest rates. And the idea is that, imagine you're the Fed doing monetary policy, there's a really bad crisis, you want to cut interest rates to try and stimulate spending. You can't really cut interest rates below zero. Okay, you can cut them slightly below zero probably. The reason is because for, well, the intuition for why it can go below zero is because you could always just hold cash. Cash has a zero interest rate. Why will you buy bonds if they pay you a negative interest rate? You could just hold cash and do better. The reason you can go negative a little bit is because if you're a large bank, holding cash is inconvenient, whereas holding bonds are more liquid from the perspective of a large bank. So then there could be a small negative interest rate. But generally, that's the idea, that you can't really go much below zero interest rates. And so there's sort of a limit on your monetary policy. And the idea there, again, is similar, right? Real interest rates are the nominal interest rate minus inflation. Now, the arguments that I had here had to do with debt deflation when on outstanding debt, right? You've borrowed already at some fixed nominal interest rates. And so when there's deflation, it means that you're paying back a really high real rate. The zero lower bound kicks in a slightly different way. So normally, of course, on new debt, not on old debt, on new debt, if there were, let's say, an increase in inflation, the Fisher effect says the nominal rate would rise and the real rate might not change much. Alternatively, if inflation is low, then the Fisher effect says the nominal rate would adjust on new debt to leave the real rate about the same. But once we've reached the zero lower bound, the nominal rate is just zero. So if there's deflation, the interest rates can no longer adjust on new debt. So even on new debt, the real rate starts to rise. And so again, that means that people either can no longer borrow because it's getting really expensive in real terms, or they are defaulting on debt that they already took out. So how does the textbook do this? The way the textbook tries to deal with this is it says that, again, below some point, either because of this factor or this factor, the demand curve no longer slopes down, and actually starts to slope upwards, i.e., as inflation goes below a certain level, maybe this is zero, now demand actually starts to decrease. Why is that a problem? It's a problem because imagine a super duper negative demand shock. It might be so bad, we actually end up here. And moreover, in addition, the Fed's interest rate policy would be ineffective at that point. So there's a big discussion, actually ever since 2008, a big discussion about if you end up in this kind of situation where the typical monetary policy is ineffective because you already hit zero interest rates. What can the Fed do to try and get the economy back to normal? It's an ongoing debate. So when you reach the end of chapter 22, you'll find this picture with this kind of kinked demand curve. And again, what it's doing is it's trying to capture this idea that either because of the zero lower bound or because of debt deflation, if inflation is low enough, and look, this is what the typical demand curve would have, right? But once you reach the zero lower bound, this means that GDP is even worse than otherwise. And actually, it also makes inflation worse. Okay? Any questions, comments about the ZLB? 3, 2, 1. First question. What is pi as far as we are concerned? Is it real GDP, inflation, potential GDP, or expected inflation? It is inflation indeed. Very good. What is pi sub e? It is indeed expected inflation. Good job, everyone. Question 3. Suppose there is a negative demand shock. If the Fed does nothing, what can happen? So the Fed just lies around. Expected inflation could decline indeed. Negative demand shock. Very good. Question 4. What can happen if expected inflation drops too much? This is the last thing we discussed. Real GDP drops, real GDP increases, the value of money increases, or interest rates decline. Real GDP can drop because of debt deflation. People start to default, and it lowers their spending. Very good. Question 5, suppose there's a negative demand shock. What should the Fed do? Should they lift interest rates, lower interest rates, lower inflation, or lower expected inflation? In the face of a negative demand shock, they should lower rates. Very good. 6, how could the Fed lower interest rates? Should they sell bonds, buy bonds, raise the discount rate, or raise the interest rate on reserves? They should buy bonds. That would increase reserves and lower the federal funds rates. Very good. Question 7, suppose there's a positive demand shock. If the Fed does nothing, what can happen? Should expected inflation rise if there's a positive demand shock, or decline? Or would it be something to do with the monetary base? If the Fed does nothing, expected inflation might rise indeed. Question 8, according to me, what might happen if expected inflation rises too much? The value of money increase, will interest rates decline, real GDP increase, or real GDP drop? Real GDP might drop indeed. Question 9, suppose there's a positive demand shock. What should the Fed do? Should it lower rates, lower taxes, or raise taxes? They should raise rates. That's right. To try and get us back to the long run. Question 10, suppose there's a positive demand shock. How could the Fed raise interest rates? Should they sell bonds, buy bonds, lower the discount rate, or lower the interest rate on reserves? Very good, everyone. They should sell bonds. Excellent. We're learning here. Question 11. Suppose there's a negative short-run supply shock. If the Fed does nothing, what might happen? There's a beautiful picture of a ship blocking the Suez Canal. Expected inflation might indeed rise. 12. Suppose there's a negative short-run supply shock. If the Fed raises rates, what might happen? This is a trickier one. If the Fed raises rates, they might get inflation back to its expected rates, but at the cost of worsening the recession. Question 13, suppose there's a negative short-run supply shock. If the Fed lowers rates, what might happen? Let's see. What do we think? If the Fed lowers rates, they're closing the recession, but they're also telling everyone, expect high inflation going forward. I'm not serious about fighting inflation. 14, 10-year interest rates are rising. What does this suggest? The expected inflation is declining. The expected inflation is rising. The gold is becoming cheaper, or the crypto is becoming cheaper. Expected inflation is rising. Oh dear. Question 15. Interest rates have been about zero since 2008. What might happen if interest rates rise due to inflation? That's right. Many businesses may close because they won't be able to afford the loans that keep them afloat. And last question. The text suggests the aggregate demand could have the following shape. Why is this? It is because of these zero lower bounds. The ZAR is the South African Rand, and, well, the zip is a zip. Okay, let's see how we did. Third place, we have Lisa. Good job. Second place, we have Sophia. Excellent. And first place, we have Marshall. Once again. All right, Marshall. So, what do you want me to do with Snapchat today?
I've done it a few times, so I'll let other people do it today.
All right. Let's see. Sophia second. What do you think?
Give me one moment. Let me think.
Sure.
Maybe try like a mohawk.
A mohawk. Let's see. There we go. How's that? Makes me look much better. Or here's another one. Okay, I like this one even more. All right, thanks everyone. I hope that was useful. I'll try and post a Kahoot a bit later. Meanwhile, feel free to contact me in office hours. Otherwise, I'll see you on Wednesday. Take care.